This is the Sci-Fi Griot, and I'm your host, Nicholas Cunningham. Over the last several episodes, we talked about sacrifice, about compromise, about what happens when survival becomes the priority. We asked what we're willing to give up. We asked whether we can go back. We asked who pays the price. Today, we're asking something different. Not a question about crisis, not a question about loss, but a question about aftermath. What must be reclaimed if the future is going to be worth living in? Because survival alone is not enough. History and science fiction are full of society that survived, but lost something essential in the process. And the danger isn't that those losses happen. The danger is when no one tries to get them back. Science fiction makes a careful distinction between survival and healing. Survival means the system continues. Healing means the damage is addressed. In Battlestar Galactica, humanity survived, but just barely. But survival doesn't erase the following. It doesn't erase trauma, guilt, mistrust, or moral injury. The fleet keeps moving, but the people inside it are changed. Science fiction insists on this truth. You can survive something and still be broken by it. And if healing never becomes a priority, the future inherits unresolved damage. That's why this episode isn't about undoing sacrifice. It's about asking what must be intentionally restored before the next crisis arrives. One of the first things society loses after prolonged crisis is moral language. Words like justice, dignity, rights, responsibility starts to feel abstract, even impractical. In Star Trek, especially post-war arches, there's always a moment where characters stop talking about what's necessary and start talking about what's right again. That shift matters because when moral language disappears, power fills the vacuum. Science fiction warns us if we stop naming values, we stop defending them. Reclaiming the future begins with reclaiming the words that describe why it should exist in the first place. Another thing often lost in crisis is accountability. In emergencies, decisions are centralized, oversight is delayed, consequences are postponed. But science fiction consistently asks what happens when the emergency ends and no one is held responsible? In Babylon 5, Captain Sheridan understands that defeating terrorism isn't enough. Someone has to answer for what happened, not for revenge, but for legitimacy. Without accountability, trust doesn't return. Without accountability, institutions don't heal. And also, without accountability, power remains suspect. Science fiction reminds us if no one answers for harm, harm becomes precedence. Reclaiming the future means insisting that survival does not excuse everything forever. Large systems think in abstraction, numbers, outcome, efficiency, but science fiction often pulls us back to the human scale. In The Expanse, moments of hope doesn't come from grand victories. It comes from people choosing empathy. It comes from individuals refusing indifference. And it comes from small acts of recognition. The future doesn't heal through systems alone. It heals when people are seen again. Reclaiming the future means restoring name, faces, and stories. Because when people become data, suffering becomes manageable, and manageable suffering always grows. One of the most powerful warnings in science fiction is about forgetting. Forgetting why sacrifices were made, forgetting who suffered, forgetting what was promised will be temporary. In Children of Men, the world functioned barely because it has learned how to live without hope. Memory fades, expectation shrinks, and when people forget what a better future looked like, they stop demanding one. Science fiction insists that memory is resistance. To remember loss is to refuse normalization. To remember injustice is to refuse repetition. Reclaiming the future means telling the story honestly, even when it's uncomfortable. Many dystopians are defined not by cruelty, but by inevitability. People believe the following: this is just how it is. There's no alternative. This is the only way things work. Science fiction challenges that resignation. In the show Arrival, the future is painful but still chosen. The story suggests something radical. Meaning doesn't come from avoiding loss, it comes from choosing with full awareness. Reclaiming the future means reclaiming the belief that choices still exist, even constrained choices, even imperfect ones, because inevitability is the most efficient tool of control. Throughout this arch, we've asked who pays the price. Now we must ask who gets to be included when rebuilding begins. Science fiction repeatedly warns that reconstruction often centers the same voices that held power before, the same perspective, the same priorities. In District 9, the system changes, but exclusion remains. Reclaiming the future means expanding who is allowed to shape it, not as charity, but as necessity. Because future designed by the few always fail the many. Science fiction doesn't give us blueprints, it gives us responsibilities. It asks us to do the following: it asks us to remember what was lost, it asks us to repair what was damaged, it asks us to refuse to confuse survival with success, and most importantly, to decide what we will not surrender again. Because every future worth living in is built not just on innovation, but on restoration. So, what must be reclaimed? Not perfection, not innocent, and certainly not the past. But what needs to be reclaimed is accountability. dignity, empathy, memory, and choice. Science fiction doesn't promise a better future. It asks whether we're willing to do the work required to deserve one. This arch has been about sacrifice, about cost, about aftermath. What comes next depends on what we choose to carry forward and what we refuse to leave behind. What will we need to reclaim before we could honestly say the crisis is over? And who must be included for that future to be real? That's my final reflection for today. This has been the Sci-Fi Griot, your host, Nicholas Cunningham, a place to slow down, to reflect, and to imagine carefully.